The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped inside the ceiling, and Megan O'Brien had long ago stopped finding the sound unsettling. 6 months at St. Michael's Medical Center in Colorado Springs had taught her how to filter out everything that wasn't patient data. Temperature of the ICU, 68 degrees. Humidity from the HVAC system, 42%. The particular pitch of the cardiac monitor in room 318, a steady rhythm that meant stable but sedated. She logged this without looking up from her tablet, her fingers moving across the screen with the same efficiency she'd once used to check ammunition counts in Baghdad 7 years ago. The 6 a.m. shift started quiet, the way Megan preferred it. The night nurse had left comprehensive handoff notes, always more thorough when the incoming nurse didn't make eye contact and didn't ask questions. Invisibility was a skill. She'd perfected it over 2 decades, learned it first in the Rangers, then honed it through 3 Pentagon reassignments, and now deployed it daily in these hallways where everyone assumed just a nurse meant exactly that. Just a nurse. Nothing more. The scrubs were crisp, white like everyone else's. Her strawberry blonde hair pulled back so tight it could have been pulled with a tactical line. Badge clipped to her waistband. Regular shoes, not combat boots, though she'd kept a pair in her locker downstairs. You never knew. Room 318 was her second check of the shift. Navy SEAL Lieutenant Marcus Chen, training accident, admitted 16 hours ago. The intake report said spinal compression from a rappelling malfunction at Fort Carson. The real reason, which Megan knew from the Pentagon briefing she'd received before arriving in Colorado, was that Chen had been pushing a new combat training protocol too hard on young enlisted men, 2 of whom had already transferred to other commands with vertebral stress fractures. Command wanted him monitored, recovered, and reassigned quietly. That's where Megan came in. Medical surveillance was just another form of investigation. She pushed the door open with her hip, her hands already occupied with the 4 bags she was replacing, the fluid warm against her palms. Chen was still under heavy sedation, his face slack, his breathing synchronized with the ventilator's mechanical whisper. The tattoo caught her eye first because her eyes were trained to catch tattoos. You never knew what unit patch or combat insignia someone carried on their skin. His left forearm, visible above the hospital blanket, bore dark ink. 3 letters, faded like it had been applied by someone without proper equipment. Megan. Her hand stopped moving. The 4 bag hung suspended for exactly 2 seconds. Then her fingers resumed their work, sliding the new bag into the 4 poles clip with the kind of smooth precision that suggested her pause had never existed. The monitor beeped its rhythmic confirmation, 78 beats per minute, steady, holding. She adjusted the drip rate by 1 milliliter, noting it in the tablet without any change to her expression, though something inside her chest had shifted like a load-bearing wall suddenly bearing an unexpected weight. She didn't recognize him. That was the most startling part. 7 years. That was how long it had been since Baghdad, since she'd drag anyone through anything. The morphine kept his eyes closed, his face slack, his mind somewhere too chemically distant to reach. Even if he'd been awake, he wouldn't remember. She'd been different then, longer hair, different name tag, different identity. Captain Megan Chen had been erased from all official records, replaced by civilian Megan O'Brien. The Pentagon had been thorough about that. They were thorough about everything. She reached for the inside of her jacket as she turned away from his bed, pressing her palm against the spot where the unit patch was sewn into the lining. 75th Ranger Regiment. Faded olive drab on the inside of tan canvas. He couldn't see it. No one could. The patch was there the way her true identity was there, present, real, but completely invisible to everyone looking at her now. She let her hand drop and continued her rounds, checking the other 3 patients in the ICU wing, each one requiring the same careful documentation, the same steady movements, the same practiced invisibility. Dr. Mercer arrived with the morning light streaming through the ICU windows, his shadow arriving before his voice did. He wore his white coat like a general wore medals, with the absolute certainty that everyone in the room understood the hierarchy. His shoes were Italian leather, buffed to a shine you could reflect instruments in. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular cadence of someone who'd spent years performing sincerity in front of hospital boards and pharmaceutical representatives. "Good morning, team. We have several cases requiring my attention this morning, and I'd appreciate your full focus." No one responded because that's not what his tone required. His tone required only acknowledgement, and acknowledgement came in the form of straightened spines and prepared charts. Megan had already pulled up the patient files on her tablet, arranged in the order she knew he'd want them: critical cases first, stable patients second, discharge planning third. She handed him the tablet as he approached the nurse station without him having to ask. He took it with the kind of absent nod you'd give a vending machine that had correctly dispensed your selection. Room 312 was his first stop, and Megan followed at the precise distance that suggested assistance without hovering. The patient was Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, 78 years old, admitted 3 days ago with post-operative atrial fibrillation following a minor surgical intervention. Her daughter sat in the corner chair, worry etched into the lines around her mouth. Her son stood with his arms crossed, a posture that suggested he'd been standing that way for hours. "Mrs. Vasquez," Mercer said, his voice descending by exactly 1 octave, his smile broadening by exactly 1 millimeter. "I wanted to check in personally this morning. Your care is our top priority." He didn't look at the monitor. He didn't check her blood pressure reading from the tablet. Instead, he turned slightly toward her daughter, letting his shoulders relax into a posture of attentive concern. "Your mother is stable, but we've had some documentation issues with her medication timing that I'm working to clarify with the nursing staff. Sometimes nurses lack the judgment required for critical care decisions in complex cases. I wanted to assure you that I'm monitoring everything personally now." The words landed with surgical precision, each one positioned to lodge doubt without quite making an accusation. Megan stood 2 feet back from the bed, her hands occupied with checking the telemetry monitor's attachment points, her face the blank slate of someone concentrating on equipment. The machine showed normal sinus rhythm, steady as a metronome. The daughter's face showed something else entirely, a sudden cloud of doubt, the kind that settled in and wouldn't lift. "The medication timing was appropriate," Megan said. The words came out quiet, flat, the kind of statement a person makes when reading from a technical manual. Mrs. Vasquez received her digoxin at 0600 hours as prescribed, with 240 milliliters of water to facilitate absorption. Mercer's smile didn't waver. It simply became a different kind of smile, the kind that predators wear when they've been briefly interrupted by something small. "Thank you for that clarification. I'm sure you followed protocol to the best of your ability. Family members often have specific expectations about these things, and I prefer to manage them directly." He turned back to the Vasquez family, his voice returning to its rehearsed warmth. "We'll continue the current course of treatment, but I'll be keeping a very close eye on all documentation going forward." He left the room with his tablet, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with the precise rhythm of someone who had decided the interaction had ended. Megan finished securing the telemetry leads and began adjusting the foredrip based on the current vital signs, her hands moving with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had performed these motions under conditions far less sterile than a Colorado Springs hospital. Sand in her fingernails. Arterial bleeding that wouldn't stop. Equipment that had been improvised from trauma bandages and prayer. This was clean. This was simple. This was almost boring. She moved to room 314, where a 72-year-old man named Robert Chen, no relation to the SEAL, though she'd checked, was recovering from pneumonia. His oxygen saturation was climbing steadily. She documented it, 94%, up from 91 the previous night. The improvement was mathematically straightforward. The relief on his face when she told him he was getting stronger was something else entirely, something that reminded her why she'd applied for nursing school after the military, why she'd accepted this assignment at St. Michael's even though it meant living as someone she wasn't, in a city where she had no one, checking on a man whose tattoo contained the only piece of her old identity anyone had left on their skin. She pressed her palm against the unit patch again as she charted his vitals, her thumb tracing the outline of the insignia through the fabric. 72 hours. That was how long the original briefing had said this assignment would take, long enough to identify 3 separate fraudulent billing schemes and document evidence of Mercer's systematic overbilling of veteran patients' insurance claims. Instead, she was logging vitals on a Navy SEAL who'd marked himself with her name, and she was doing it in this hospital with these fluorescent lights and this steady heartbeat that kept its own time. The next words out of the intercom changed everything. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 4. Code Blue. Room 312 smelled like antiseptic and the faint copper undertone of healing wounds. Mrs. Patterson sat propped against 3 pillows, her 78-year-old spine freshly repaired by Dr. Mercer's scalpel 6 days ago, recovery proceeding exactly as planned until Megan entered with the 08 for 4 medication dose. The elderly woman's daughter stood by the window, watching Colorado Springs sprawl beneath the afternoon sun, trusting that the hospital was taking care of her mother. It was. Dr. Mercer arrived 2 minutes after Megan began documenting the pain medication in Mrs. Patterson's chart. Mrs. Patterson, I need to apologize on behalf of St. Michael's, he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth he reserved for moments when an audience was present. He positioned himself between Megan and the door, not accidentally, never accidentally. His movements were calculated, precise as a surgeon's incision. Some nurses lack the judgment for critical care decisions. Megan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She continued logging vitals, her pen moving across the chart with mechanical steadiness, the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse than a doctor's public condescension. Nurse O'Brien here documented your pain medication at 08 for 7, Mercer continued, his gaze never leaving the patient's face, ensuring maximum audience engagement. Protocol clearly states documentation must occur within 3 minutes of administration. We can't have sloppy paperwork putting patients at risk. Mrs. Patterson's daughter turned from the window, confusion rippling across her face. The medication had been administered at 08 for 4. Documentation at 08 for 7 was textbook protocol compliance. Megan knew this. Mercer knew this. The difference was that Mercer had 17 years of medical school prestige, a voice like a tank idling in a garage, and the kind of institutional authority that made patients' families doubt their own math. Dr. Mercer, the medication was administered at 08 for 4 and documented at 08 for 7, Megan said quietly, her fingers steady on the pen. Well within the 3-minute window. Protocol for point 7 is satisfied. The temperature in the room shifted. Are you contradicting my assessment of hospital policy? Mercer's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The disappointment in those words was a scalpel of its own. Perhaps you should review section 4.7 of the nursing manual before you endanger more patients. Megan finished the notation. Placed the chart in its holder. Made eye contact with Mrs. Patterson, just long enough for the older woman to see that her nurse was not the problem, and then walked toward the door. Mercer didn't move. She stopped. Waited. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. His eyes were pale blue, the color of ice water, and they carried the certainty of a man who had never once been told no by someone he could actually hurt. Megan stepped around him, her scrubs brushing the doorframe, and left without a word. The break room cleared within seconds. Megan sat down with her sandwich at 1,115 hours, a turkey and Swiss she'd packed at 0530 that morning, methodical, purposeful, the meal of someone who understood that hunger was a distraction she couldn't afford. Nurse Jessica Rodriguez stood immediately, mumbling something about checking on a patient. Within 30 seconds, the room was empty except for the fluorescent hum overhead and the sound of a refrigerator compressor cycling. Megan unwrapped her sandwich. Ate exactly half. Wrapped the remainder in foil. The loudspeaker crackled at 1,147 hours. Megan O'Brien to room 318. Megan O'Brien to room 318. She stood, discarded the uneaten portion in the trash, and walked back toward the ICU with the kind of calm that only comes when you've already made peace with sacrifice. By 1500 hours, a disciplinary write-up appeared on the public unit board at the nurse station. Nurse M. O'Brien, improper medication documentation timing, room 312-08 for 7 hours, violation of protocol for point 7, recommend mandatory review and retraining. It was the third such complaint in 14 days. The first had appeared after Megan rotated through orthopedic surgery, where she'd observed Dr. Mercer billing for spinal procedures on 3 workers' compensation patients who didn't require surgery. The second came after she documented inconsistencies in post-operative pain management charts on his cardiovascular cases, medication dosages that didn't match patient weight or surgical complexity. This third was different. This one was personal. Megan stood in front of the board, reading her own damnation under the fluorescent lights, and felt absolutely nothing. The emptiness was professional. Practiced. It was the same emotional vacancy that had sustained her through Baghdad, through 3 tours that had never officially appeared in any medical database, through 7 years of living as someone she wasn't. Nurse Chen whispered to a third-year resident nearby, loud enough to be heard. "Poor thing. Mercer's got it out for her. I heard he requested she be removed from his post-op rotation." The resident nodded sympathetically. The narrative was simple: brilliant surgeon, problematic nurse, institutional correction. Nobody examined the pattern. Nobody pulled the billing records. Nobody asked why Mercer's surgical wing had the highest infection rates in the hospital, why his patients healed slower, why the outcome data didn't match his reputation. What they didn't know was that Megan had been documenting everything. Every procedure. Every billing code cross-referenced against actual patient outcomes. Every margin that didn't add up. Building a case that extended far beyond Colorado Springs, far beyond St. Michael's, into a network of fraudulent coding and Pentagon-laundered funds that would take down not just Mercer but his entire surgical consortium. The mission she'd been placed here to complete required invisibility. Mercer's attention was a threat she couldn't afford. But that wasn't the worst part. The code red alarm shrieked at 1,400 hours, the sound cutting through the ICU like a blade, piercing and absolute. Megan was at the nurse station reviewing Mrs. Patterson's discharge paperwork when the alert came through: room 318, Marcus Chen, surgical site rupture, blood pressure dropping. She moved before the announcement finished, her body responding with muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing school. Down the corridor. Past the pharmacy. Into room 318 where the air smelled like ozone and fear and the metallic tang of too much blood. Chen's surgical drain showed bright red blood, far too much, flowing at the rate of internal hemorrhage. His pressure had collapsed to 90/60 and was still falling. 80/50. His lips were turning blue at the margins. Mercer arrived within 90 seconds, his white coat pristine, his movements fluid with authority. "Get a crash cart," he commanded, his voice loud and decisive. "Call the OR. Somebody page cardiothoracic. Move." The residents scattered like startled birds. Chen's pressure dropped to 70/40. Megan calculated 6 minutes to get him to the operating room, 4 minutes to prep the surgical suite, 3 more before a cardiothoracic surgeon could open him up and find the bleed. That was 13 minutes. Chen would be dead in 8. She made the decision before conscious thought could catch up with it. Megan pulled the crash cart close, yanked open the sterile pack with movements that were too practiced, too precise, and grabbed the scalpel. Her hands moved on their own now, guided by something older than nursing, deeper than training. "Nurse O'Brien, what are you?" Mercer started. She didn't answer. The incision went between the 5th and 6th ribs. Skin. Muscle. Fascia. 3 strokes, decisive and economical, the blade moving as if her hands remembered exactly how much pressure would penetrate without shattering bone. She grabbed the retractor, a tool she shouldn't know how to use, positioned it exactly right, and spread the rib cage. Blood welled up immediately, obscuring everything, but her fingers found the bleeder by feel alone. Torn intercostal artery, bright scarlet blood pumping in rhythm with Chen's collapsing heart. She clamped it. Pressure. Direct pressure. The arterial flow stopped. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Once. Twice. 3 times. Chen's pressure climbed 80/50. 90/55. Stabilizing. The resident stood frozen, mouths open, watching a nurse perform an emergency thoracotomy with the fluid precision of apex predators. This wasn't in the textbooks. This wasn't protocol. This was something else entirely. Mercer's face went pale, then red, a color progression that said he understood exactly what he was witnessing and exactly what it meant. Chen's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, morphine-hazed and distant. He looked at Megan, recognition flickering somewhere deep in his brain, something struggling to surface through the pharmaceutical fog. His lips moved. "Reaper," he whispered, and then consciousness released him back into darkness. Mercer heard it. So did the two residents and the nurse who had rushed in with the crash cart. Megan's hands were covered in blood up to her wrists, her scrubs soaked red, but her breathing remained steady. She looked at the monitor, at Chen's stabilized vitals, at the artery she'd just clamped, and then at Dr. Mercer, whose entire face had rearranged itself into something caught between fury and fear. "Get him to the OR," she said quietly. "Now." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence in the room was so thick you could have operated in it, and the only sound was the steady beep of the cardiac monitor and the distant wail of the elevator arriving to carry Chen toward surgery. Within 30 minutes, hospital administration was reviewing security footage. Within an hour, Dr. Mercer was in the hospital director's office, explaining how a nurse had performed an unauthorized surgical procedure that violated hospital protocol sections for .7 through 4.11, possibly several other regulations he would be compiling over the next few hours. By 1700 hours, security was on its way to the nurse station with papers that would end everything Megan had built here. The code red alarm shrieked at 1400 hours, a sound like an air horn in a concrete bunker, and Marcus Chen's monitor flatlined from sinus rhythm to chaos. His pressure bottomed out at nothing, literally nothing, a number that should not exist in a living body. ICU nurses moved on instinct, calling rapid response, but Megan was already moving toward room for 12 before the announcement finished crackling through the overhead speakers. She didn't run. Running was panic. She walked with purpose, her stride matching the controlled urgency of someone who had done this before. The surgical site on Chen's left anterior chest was bleeding. Not seeping. Bleeding. The clear adhesive dressing had darkened to rust, and the blood was pooling underneath his skin like a second set of lungs filling with the wrong fluid. Dr. Mercer stood in the doorway of the ICU bay, his expression moving through the theater of concern, furrowed brow, pursed lips, hands clasped in front of him like a portrait of a doctor who cared deeply and would definitely order someone else to fix this. "Get cardiothoracic down here," he announced loudly enough for the nurse's station to hear, establishing his authority for the audience. "We need an attending. Now." But Chen's oxygen was dropping. 88. 85. 81. The numbers were telling a story that cardiothorax couldn't read in time. An attending was 6 minutes away on a good day. Chen had 3 before his brain started dying. The crash cart was 3 feet away. Megan's hand found the trauma shears, the ones with the call sign engraved on the handle, the MacGuffin she'd carried through 3 wars and never shown a soul at St. Michael's. She opened the emergency airway tray instead, because that was the cover story, the civilian nurse story, the limited scope of practice story. But her eyes were tracking something else. The bleeding site. The angle. The position of his ribs. She was measuring anatomy that didn't exist on any hospital chart. "I need to decompress," she said quietly, already opening a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Dr. Mercer turned from the doorway. "Ms. O'Brien, step back. That patient is about to be taken to the OR. You're a floor nurse, not." She didn't step back. She didn't acknowledge him. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory that belonged to someone who wasn't a floor nurse, someone who had spent 7 years learning how to keep soldiers alive in places where hospitals didn't exist. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The hiss of air escaping. Chen's oxygen jumped. 85. 88. 91. "Get me a scalpel," she said. "Ms. O'Brien, that's enough." Mercer's voice had taken on the edge of someone losing control of a room that was supposed to revolve around his authority. The resident, a young man whose name Megan had never learned, handed her the scalpel. He was moving on something that had nothing to do with Mercer's orders. Everyone in the room was. The oxygen was climbing. 92. 95. She was buying time, and time was the only currency that mattered right now. Her hands made the incision. Not the tentative cut of someone learning from a textbook. The decisive incision of someone who had done this in a blown-out compound in Baghdad with mortar rounds walking across the courtyard, who had done this with a combat knife because scalpels were luxury items she couldn't afford. The bleeding site opened, and she could see it now, the surgical site rupture, the vessel, the damage. Pain is information. Pain is data. This pain told her that Chen was minutes away from exsanguination, from bleeding out while administrative protocol got its paperwork in order. She found the bleeder with her fingers first, applying pressure while her left hand reached for a clamp. The satin sky clamp from the trauma set, an instrument designed for exactly this scenario, for the moment when a surgeon couldn't get to the operating room fast enough. She clamped. The bleeding stopped. The monitor stabilized. 96% oxygen. 102 BPM, elevated but survivable. Sinus rhythm. The room held its breath. Dr. Mercer's face had transformed into something raw and exposed. He wasn't the concerned physician anymore. He was a man watching his authority evaporate in real time, watching a floor nurse perform emergency open cardiac massage with the precision of someone who had attended a surgical fellowship he knew nothing about. His mouth opened twice without producing sound, and then he was moving, pushing toward the door, and Megan understood exactly what he was doing. He was leaving to document this. He was going to make notes while the memory was fresh, timestamps, witness statements, the legal architecture of destruction. "I need a level 1 rapid infuser and 2 units of O-negative, fresh," Megan said to the resident, and the young man nodded and was gone, moving like someone who had just realized that the person in front of him wasn't a regular floor nurse, that the way she was moving, the way she was calling orders, the way she wasn't asking for permission, none of that came from St. Michael's orientation program. "And call cardiothoracic back. Tell them we've got a stable patient en route. ETA for minutes." She was lying about the stability, but it was a professional lie. Chen would be stable in 4 minutes because she would keep him stable. Her hands would keep him stable. The clamp would hold the bleeder until real surgeons could take over, and they would take over, and the investigation would collapse like a structure built on sand, and everything she had built here for 16 months would be ash. But Marcus Chen would live. That was the only number that mattered. The cardiothoracic surgical team met them in the operating room 16 minutes later. The senior surgeon, Dr. Patricia Vance's protégé, a woman with the same precise movements Megan had seen in herself, looked at the field, at the clamp, at the work that had been done with a crash cart and a floor nurse's hands. "Who did this?" she asked, not looking up from the patient. No one answered. The residents were busy, the surgical nurses were moving, and Mercer was nowhere near the operating room. Megan was still beside the table, still monitoring Chen's vitals, still counting seconds. She was about to step back, to fade into the background where floor nurses belonged, when Dr. Vance's hand came up. "You. Stay. Guide me through exactly what you clamped and where." So she did. She stayed. She guided. She used words like hemorrhage control and contained bleeding instead of the field medicine language that lived in her hands, and Dr. Vance worked in perfect synchronicity with her, stitch by stitch, rebuilding what had been torn, reinforcing what had been broken. The surgery took 90 minutes. By the time Chen was in recovery, his blood pressure was stable, his oxygen was climbing, and his heart was beating in perfect sinus rhythm, a rhythm that belonged to a man who had survived because someone had refused to follow protocol, refused to defer to authority, refused to let 16 months of strategic placement matter more than 3 minutes of a dying patient's life. By 16:30 hours, Megan was standing in Administrator Karen Walsh's office, her scrubs changed, her hands clean. Walsh had the security footage pulled up on her computer, 90 seconds of crystal-clear video showing exactly what Megan had done, exactly how she had done it, and exactly how impossible it was for someone with a nursing degree to know how to move like that. "Ms. O'Brien," Walsh said, and her voice carried the weight of someone about to end a career, "I need you to explain how you know how to perform a procedure that requires 7 years of surgical training. Field thoracotomy isn't something that appears in the RN licensing curriculum." Megan sat in the chair across from Walsh's desk, her expression neutral, her hand steady in her lap. She knew what was coming. She had known what was coming the moment Chen's pressure started dropping, the moment she made the choice to break cover instead of break protocol. If she explained, she blew the investigation. 16 months of undercover placement, dozens of flagged billing discrepancies, a case that could have saved the VA hundreds of thousands and protected dozens of veterans from unnecessary surgeries, all of it gone the moment she admitted what she was. If she didn't explain, she lost her access to the hospital and the investigation died anyway. Different endpoint, same extinction. "I can't explain that right now," Megan said quietly. Walsh's expression hardened. "Then I have no choice." By 1700 hours, security was escorting her out of St. Michael's. They took her badge, the laminate was worn at the corner where she'd carried it for 16 months, and deactivated her access codes with 3 keystrokes. The walk to her car was made in silence, the kind of silence that comes from crossing a threshold you can't uncross. The rain had started during her shift, light at first, then building into something that hammered the parking lot like applause for a show she had just walked away from. She drove home with her hand steady on the wheel, her eyes on the road, her mind calculating what had been lost. Not just a job. A mission. A carefully constructed network of observation, a Pentagon-authorized investigation into systematic fraud that had been building momentum for nearly a year and a half. She had flags on 18 separate cases, all of them connected to Dr. Mercer's lucrative workers' compensation spinal procedures, all of them showing the same pattern: unnecessary surgeries, inflated billing codes, kickback arrangements with physical therapy companies that appeared on billing statements as unrelated vendors. But Marcus Chen had been dying. And some things mattered more than missions. She reached the house, a nondescript rental on the south side of Colorado Springs, nothing that would connect her to anyone or anything, and sat in the driveway without turning off the engine. Through the windshield, the rain was falling in sheets now, turning the world into something fractured and abstract. She had made her choice at 1,400 hours when the code red alarm shrieked, and there was no walking back from it. What happened next would be consequences. What happened next would be the investigation imploding, the Pentagon calling her handler, the reassignment papers arriving within 24 hours, the careful placement dismantled like a disassembled gun. What happened next would be failure, the kind of failure that no amount of competence could overcome, the kind of failure that came from choosing humanity over strategy. But Marcus Chen would live. That counted for something. That had to count for something. By 1,500 hours, the complaint was already filed. 3 pages of formal language printed on hospital letterhead, each word a nail hammered into a coffin. Unauthorized procedures violating hospital protocol sections 4.7 through 4.11. Mercer had moved fast, faster than Megan expected, which meant he was panicked. A panicked man is a dangerous man, but a panicked man who controls institutional power is something else entirely. He'd already called his contact in the state medical board. Already sent a courtesy email to the hospital's insurance carrier flagging a potential liability event. By the time Megan finished her shift report at 16:45, the machinery was in motion. Security arrived at 1,700 hours. 2 officers, both uncomfortable, both avoiding her eyes as they escorted her from the unit. Her badge was deactivated before she reached the elevator. The little beep that usually granted her access now produced only silence, a small red light blinking like a heartbeat that had stopped. The officer, a woman named Reynolds whom Megan had nodded to 100 times in the cafeteria, placed a sealed envelope in her hands. Hospital legal sent this down. Not "I'm sorry." Not "this is bullshit." Just the facts, delivered with the emotional content of a vending machine. The envelope contained 2 pages. First page, Termination of employment effective immediately. Second page, a hold on her final paycheck pending the outcome of the investigation. 7 years of careful placement, 7 years of living as someone else, 7 years of a mission so classified that her own son didn't know his mother was anything other than a tired nurse working double shifts, all of it burned in the time it took for a SEAL to bleed out and a surgeon to decide his patient's life was worth less than his reputation. The Mountain View Diner was open 24 hours, which was the only reason Megan was there at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. 12 booths, 7 of them empty, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in amber. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago, a thin skin forming on the surface like something dying slowly. She hadn't ordered anything else. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with dyed black hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, had stopped asking if she needed anything around 2:30. The window reflected Megan back at herself. Dark hair pulled tight. Civilian clothes, jeans, a blue sweater, the jacket with the faded 75th Ranger Regiment unit patch sewn into the lining where no one could see it. Just a woman. Just a woman who'd sacrificed 7 years of her life to a mission, lived in apartments with no furniture, made video calls to her son from safe houses and motels where the staff knew better than to ask questions. Dylan was 17 now. He'd been 10 when she left. She'd missed his middle school graduation because she was embedded at a clinic in Nevada doing preliminary surveillance on insurance fraud patterns. She'd missed his first day of high school because of a briefing in D.C. She'd missed his 16th birthday because the mission required her to be at St. Michael's, had required her to smile at Dr. Mercer's condescension and accept his dismissals and let him humiliate her in public because a Navy SEAL who'd saved her life once might one day need her to save his back. And she had. She'd cracked his chest with a scalpel and clamped the bleeder and performed a procedure that would have gotten a civilian nurse 10 years in federal prison if the circumstances had been even slightly different. The risk calculation had taken 3 seconds. The patient or the mission? The person she used to be or the person she was pretending to be? Some choices don't feel like choices at all. They just feel like the only thing you could possibly do. Megan reached into her jacket and pressed her hand against the unit patch, feeling the rough fabric through the lining. A 75th Ranger Regiment patch, faded from 7 years of being hidden. Before Baghdad. Before the army. Before she became someone's ghost in scrubs. The patch was a reminder of the person she'd been before all of this, a soldier who operated in daylight, who wore a uniform with her rank visible, who didn't have to hide the most important parts of herself from everyone around her. That version of Megan had died somewhere between Baghdad in 2016 and Colorado Springs in 2024. The Pentagon didn't want her back in combat. Too much history, too many classified operations, too many witnesses who'd already been handled or relocated. So they'd given her another kind of mission. They turned her into a ghost and sent her into hospitals to find fraud. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos on her encrypted secure folder. Dylan at 14, 13, 12. Each birthday marked in time-lapse. The most recent one from last month showed a kid who looked like a man now, same jaw as his father, same serious eyes as Megan, broad shoulders that spoke of teenage growth and something harder underneath. He'd written in the background of that photo, "Mom, when will you be able to visit again?" She'd responded 3 hours later from a hospital bathroom, "Soon, baby. Soon." The lie had tasted like copper. The diner's clock read 3:32. Outside, the Colorado Springs darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. Highway 24 ran past the restaurant, and Megan could hear the distant rumble of a semi-truck moving through the pre-dawn silence, its engine the only sound in a world that had gone very, very quiet. She destroyed her cover to save a man's life. She'd blown 7 years of careful work in 3 hours. Her handler would reassign her. The Pentagon would find another ghost for another hospital. And she would become someone else again, in some other city, in some other lie. She ordered another coffee, but didn't drink it. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Captain O'Brien, your assignment status is under review. Do not attempt to contact your son. Maintain radio silence until further instruction." The message deleted itself 30 seconds after she read it. That was the protocol. That was what happened when you broke mission parameters. You lost everything except the job, and sometimes you lost that too. At 3:43, she made a decision that would have gotten her court-martialed if she'd still been active duty. She called Dylan. Not from her secure phone. From her personal cell, the number that could be traced to exactly this diner, this booth, this moment. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and something else, something that sounded like worry. Mom. Dylan's voice cracked on the single word. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, baby, Megan said, and her voice didn't shake. She'd been trained by the best to keep her voice level under pressure, to deliver information with no emotional content, to sound like a machine reading coordinates. But right now, talking to her 17-year-old son in the middle of the night, she let a small piece of the lie fall away. I just wanted to hear your voice. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. His chemistry test coming up. His friend Marcus getting a new truck and the way they'd driven to Castle Rock on Sunday just to see how fast it would go on the highway. His college applications, which were due in 2 weeks. Dylan talked around the question that clearly lived in his mouth. Where was she? Why was she calling at 3 in the morning? Was something bad happening? And Megan let him talk without answering, just present, just there, just a mother listening to her son's voice like it was the most important intelligence briefing she'd ever received. When they hung up, Megan sat in the booth for another hour, watching her reflection fade as the darkness outside began to shift toward gray. She deleted the unsent text to her handler. She finished the cold coffee. She paid her check and left a 30% tip because Reynolds the security guard had a daughter in community college and every dollar counted. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was driving home and parking in her garage and going down to the basement where she kept the boxes she thought Dylan didn't know about. The cardboard containers holding the only evidence that she'd ever been anything other than a nurse. Inside those boxes, uniforms with captain's bars, ribbons in their presentation cases, a photograph of a younger version of herself in desert combat boots standing with 8 other soldiers in front of a Humvee with Reaper 6 spray painted on the side, incident reports filed under her service number rather than her civilian name. At 3:54 in the morning, Megan opened the box containing her dress blues. The uniform hadn't been worn in 7 years. The fabric was stiff with storage, and when she lifted the jacket, dust particles caught the basement light like tiny ghosts of all the time that had passed. She pressed the uniform against her chest and stood in the darkness, holding onto the only part of herself she'd been allowed to keep. She didn't know that Dylan had come down an hour after their phone call. Didn't know that her son had opened those same boxes and seen his mother's rank insignia, her medals, her service records. Didn't know that Dylan was holding a shadow box he'd constructed himself from materials purchased at the craft store, carefully arranging his mother's silver star, her bronze star with V device, the 2 purple hearts, the combat medical badge. Didn't know that her 17-year-old son had made a decision of his own, to stop letting her carry all the weight alone, to stop accepting her lies about double shifts and overtime, to walk into St. Michael's Hospital and force the world to see who his mother actually was. The hospital board meeting started at 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning, and by 1000 hours, Admiral James Kensington had authorized the release of everything, 18 months of investigation findings, video evidence, billing records, the complete constellation of fraud that Dr. Marcus Mercer had woven through St. Michael's like a tumor through healthy tissue. The documentation was devastating in its precision, 73 falsified procedures, 41 of them performed on veterans whose care should have been sacred, billed at maximum complexity codes for surgeries that took half the documented time. MedTech Solutions, a medical equipment supplier, had been funneling $2,300 per procedure to Mercer under the euphemism of consulting fees, kickbacks dressed up in corporate language. The Admiral's decision meant every state board, every federal prosecutor, every news organization with a medical beat would have access to the evidence within 48 hours. It wasn't a recommendation. It was a command. By 1100 hours, the Colorado Medical Board had the files. By 1200 hours, 3 of Mercer's surgical partners requested immediate reassignment. The machinery of institutional justice, once engaged, moves with the relentless precision of a diesel engine, unstoppable, grinding, inevitable. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Mercer. At 1,347 hours, a 47-second video clip emerged on a nursing advocacy forum, then spread to veteran Facebook groups, then exploded across social media like shrapnel from a breach charge. Security footage from room 312, captured 6 weeks earlier. Mercer's voice, clear and condescending, his hand gesturing dismissively toward Megan while an elderly woman and her terrified daughter watched from the hospital bed. "Clipboard Carrie," he called her. His teeth showed when he smiled, not a smile of warmth, but something predatory, something designed to wound. "Some nurses lack the judgment for critical care decisions," he said, his voice dripping with the fake concern he'd perfected over 15 years. The video was 47 seconds. It went viral in 6 hours. By evening, 2.3 million views. Nursing groups shared it. Veteran advocacy organizations amplified it. Medical ethics watchdogs posted it with commentary about systemic abuse. The comment section filled with stories: nurses humiliated, providers who had suffered under his cruelty, patients who questioned their care after his public questioning of their providers. One comment, liked 47,000 times, "This is why medical hierarchies kill people. This man shouldn't be teaching interns, let alone practicing surgery." Then came 1900 hours and the statement that changed everything. Dr. Patricia Vance, 73 years old, semi-retired in Boston, founder of the Vance Foundation for Medical Excellence, had watched the video 3 times. Mercer's medical school mentor. The woman who had written his recommendation letter for his surgical fellowship 15 years ago, whose endorsement had launched his career. She picked up her phone and her statement went out to the medical community, the hospital, the press. 68 words that carried the weight of a career destroyed by someone she had mentored. "I am horrified and deeply disappointed by the conduct of Dr. Marcus Mercer, whose behavior toward nursing staff and patients represents everything I fought against in my 40 years of medical practice." Effective immediately, the Vance Foundation is severing all professional relationships with Dr. Mercer and initiating a review of any programs or positions connected to his participation. "He does not represent the values I attempted to instill in my students." The statement hit like an artillery round hitting its target. The Vance Foundation funded half of St. Michael's research programs. Dr. Vance's name opened doors and closed them with equal authority. By 2,100 hours, the St. Michael's board voted unanimously to terminate Mercer's privileges pending investigation. By 22:15 hours, Mercer's attorney was on the phone with federal prosecutors, negotiating the surrender of his medical license in exchange for avoiding criminal fraud charges that would have meant prison time. His career, built on performance and manipulation and the strategic humiliation of people who couldn't fight back, collapsed in 11 hours and 15 minutes. Megan watched the news coverage from her living room that evening, Dylan sitting beside her on the couch. The local anchor's voice carried that particular tone of scandal, shocked surprise masking satisfaction. Medical license voluntarily surrendered, federal investigation ongoing, patients encouraged to contact the Colorado Medical Board if they believe their care was compromised. Dylan reached over and squeezed her hand. She didn't smile. Didn't celebrate. Didn't feel the surge of triumph she might have expected. Just sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, watching a man's entire professional identity disintegrate in real time because he had never understood who he was threatening. He had seen scrubs and a clipboard and a woman who didn't fight back in the ways he recognized. He hadn't seen the combat medic who had dragged wounded soldiers through Baghdad streets. He hadn't seen the officer who had completed black site training that would make most civilians' nightmares seem quaint. He had seen exactly what he wanted to see, an easy target, someone small enough to bully, someone whose silence he could weaponize. That was his fatal mistake. That was the moment his institutional power meant nothing. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in late summer, Megan walked past Pikes Peak Community College in dress blue so crisp they could cut paper, the faded unit patch finally mounted properly above her captain's bars on her left shoulder. The mountain light was brilliant and clean, the kind of Colorado sunshine that made everything seem sharper, more defined. Through the window of room 114, she could see 12 students practicing chest compressions on training dummies, their hands pumping the rubber chests in synchronized rhythm. An instructor in a polo shirt, navy blue, generic, the kind of uniform a man wears when he's stopped being anything more than ordinary, demonstrated proper hand placement. His face was thin now, worn like something that had been weathered. His nameplate read Mercer, Basic Life Support Instructor. This was all that remained, minimum wage, community college, teaching people who would forget his name by next semester. He didn't look up as Megan passed the window. Didn't know she was there. She continued walking, 3 blocks east toward the Veterans Affairs office, where the door had her name on it now, Captain Megan O'Brien, Regional Coordinator for Patient Advocacy and Fraud Prevention. The position had been created specifically because of what she'd found at St. Michael's, because Admiral Kensington believed that the systemic abuse she'd uncovered wasn't unique, that it was probably replicated in hospitals across 3 states, that veterans were targeted precisely because their care was profitable and their complaints often got filed away in bureaucratic silence. Her office overlooked Garden of the Gods, those red rocks reaching up like accusations against the blue sky, the geological equivalent of truth you couldn't argue with. On her desk, a photograph from Dylan's high school graduation 2 weeks earlier, Megan standing beside him in civilian clothes, both of them smiling with the kind of relief that comes from surviving something together. The photo had Marcus Chen's flowers beside it, white lilies with a card that read in his careful handwriting, "Some debts can't be repaid, only honored. Thank you, Reaper 6. The nurses from St. Michael's had sent a basket of tea and chocolates with a handwritten note, "We should have stood with you from the beginning. We won't make that mistake again." The hiss of the office air conditioner was the sound of institutional machinery working, the refrigerated precision of paperwork and databases and case files. Dr. Patricia Vance had sent a letter on Vance Foundation letterhead, offering to fund Dylan's entire 4-year college education, tuition, books, housing, everything. For the family who sacrificed while others merely served, she wrote. It was the kind of gesture that Megan would have refused 6 months ago, before she understood that accepting help wasn't weakness, that letting people stand with you was its own kind of strength. She'd accepted. Dylan had chosen a university in California. They were both learning how to move forward in daylight instead of shadow. Now, sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee that had grown cold sometime in the last 2 hours, Megan opened the morning's case files, 3 potential fraud flags at hospitals in Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming. The patterns were identical to Mercer's playbook: unnecessary procedures on vulnerable populations, billing code inflation, equipment supplier kickbacks masked as consulting arrangements, careful documentation designed to look legitimate to anyone not trained to see the fraud. Veterans targeted. Care compromised. Institutional protection preventing investigation. The work stretched out ahead of her like a road with no visible end, and she understood now that this was the actual mission, that the St. Michael's investigation had been the beginning of something larger. Through her office window, a red-tailed hawk circled above the rocks, riding thermals in the thin mountain air with the kind of effortless precision that came from knowing exactly how to use every available resource. Dylan texted at 1,430 hours, "Proud of you, Mom." She texted back immediately, "Proud of you too, baby." Then she returned to the case files, to the spreadsheets and cross-reference documents and the careful methodology of building airtight evidence that would hold up in federal court. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. And sometimes, if they're lucky, they get to do it in daylight, wearing their own name, their own rank, their own face. Sometimes they get to do it in an office with a view of mountains, with a son who knows who they really are, with colleagues who finally understand that the quiet person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. Megan made a note on her screen: request cross-jurisdictional audit of MedTech Solutions contracts at all VA-affiliated hospitals, 2018 to 2024. The work continued. The work would always continue. But now she did it as herself. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever watched someone's arrogance become their destruction, or if you've ever questioned whether speaking up was worth a cost, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below, what would you have done in Megan's position? The quietest warriors change the world. We just don't always see it until it's too late for those who hurt them.